Welcome to Fluxedo Junction. I'm Scott Kukler. Each episode, we bring you the best music of all genres from throughout the world, and this week we'll be speaking with classical guitarist and composer Robert Phillips. Robert began teaching himself guitar at the age of 12, not working with a teacher until 2 years later. After taking lessons for a year, he began studying classical guitar at the suggestion of his teacher. He earned his Doctor of Musical Arts from the University of Miami and made his New York recital debut at Weill Recital Hall at Carnegie Hall in 1987. His accomplishments and accolades are almost too many to mention here, and his body of recorded work is both diverse and extensive, so perhaps it's best to start things off with one of his most recent releases. Here's a piece composed by John W. Powell and performed by Robert titled Nocturne No. 12, here on Fluxedo Junction. Thank you so much, first of all, for making time for me. I really appreciate it.
Oh, it's a pleasure. It's a pleasure.
Great. Okay, let's jump right into it. Since the last time we spoke with you, you've been really, really busy. I know that you recently retired from your full-time teaching position at the university, correct? But you're still doing private educational stuff, and then, of course, you're still performing and recording. Tell us a little bit about what you've been up to lately.
All right. Well, let's see. I've been up to a lot of things lately. As you mentioned, performing and recording. I'm working on a commissioning project that I'm very excited about. You know, there's a long tradition in classical music of commissioning composers to write pieces. In fact, if you've ever seen the movie Amadeus,
yes,
you may recall that at the end of the movie there is Salieri is anonymously commissioning Mozart to write a requiem that ultimately is he's going to claim to have written for himself. Now, of course, that there's no truth to that. Salieri didn't, in fact, commission that piece, but it was actually commissioned anonymously by someone else. And that's part of a long tradition. And I've done a fair amount of commissioning myself in the past, and I'm working on a project right now that I'm really excited about. This particular commissioning project, I've approached 5 composers who are all from different countries originally and now reside in the U.S. And I've asked them to each compose a piece of music in a dance rhythm that is reflective of their native cultures.
That's fascinating. It's actually pretty timely too, I would say, because with the world and the condition it's in right now, any chance that anybody has in any art or industry to sort of bridge gaps between different cultures can only be a useful thing right now with the sorry state of affairs.
Absolutely. And you know, I've got I started working on this project over a year ago. You know, this is a long-term thing, finding the composers and then finding the funding to pay for it, and then getting the music from them and learning it. And so I'm still in the middle of the whole thing, which is great. But some of the composers that I've gotten, I've got. You know, I was looking for diversity. One of the things that, by the way, that I included in the diversity is out of these 5 composers, 3 of them are women, which I wanted to get at least one woman, but I wound up getting 3, so that was pretty interesting. One of them is a woman who is originally from Belarus, Olga Amelkina-Vera. Olga is a well-known composer in the classical guitar world. So she's contributed a piece of music using 2 different Belarusian folk songs that she uses as her springboard for this piece of music, and then jumps off from there and composes around them. I've got an Argentinian composer who wrote a wonderful milonga for me, which I'm flattered. He even titled it Milonga pa Roberto. so it's for me. Then I've got I contacted a composer who's originally from Uganda, Fred O. He refers to himself as Fred O because most Americans have a difficult time pronouncing his name. It's actually Onovero Suwoke. So, you know, it's much easier to go with Fred O for him. But he actually sent me 3 pieces representing 3 different rhythms from parts of Africa, different parts of Africa. So that was kind of exciting. And I've got 2 more pieces that I'm waiting for that I have to, you know, finish raising the money for them and then finish paying for them. One is an Israeli composer, and one of them is a Kuwaiti composer of Palestinian descent.
Oh, wow.
So, yeah. So the right now with what's going on in the world, the Israeli and the Palestinian, I think are just, I'm so glad that I've got both of those in this set, that, you know, with what's going on right now. And what's going on right now, of course, they both have relatives over in their native countries, and so they're a little bit behind on their composing for me, but it's more than understandable because they've got so much on their mind.
Oh, sure.
To their families. Yeah.
I wonder if you could tell me what you see the role of the artist being in the world at the moment. I think I've always felt that the role changes depending on, what's going on. And I would just be really interested in getting your point of view on that with everything that's been going on.
There are many, many times where I've thought of the artist as being kind of the canary in the coal mine, but I think right now it's not so much that role as being that of a kind of a biblical prophet, pointing the way to where we should be moving. as I said, the role of the artist. There's two possible roles of the artist, and it depends on what's going on in the world. One of them is the canary in the coal mine of letting us know, reflecting what's already happening. But I think the artist can also be that of the prophet, pointing the way to what's about to happen, or the direction that we may be headed as being wrong. And I think in terms of John Lennon and Yoko Ono in the late 1960s, early 1970s, pointing the way and saying we have to make some changes because peace has to be, we need peace. And I think right now the role of the artist should be that, very much so, of kind of shaking the world up and saying to the world, look, this is we're moving in the wrong direction, and we as artists have to kind of not only point the way but also be an example to the world.
I'd love to explore the flip side of that idea with you for a moment. And of course, there's not going to be any definitive right answer to this, but I am curious because I've always respected your intellect. You're one of my mentors, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this. A very good friend of mine and I had a discussion about Yusuf Islam, the former Cat Stevens.
Sure.
And with the somewhat recent attack on Salman Rushdie, he got all fired up again about how much he hates Yusuf Islam. Now, I remember as teenagers and young adults, we both loved Cat Stevens' music, and he will no longer listen to it. It's not just that he won't listen to it. He says now that he dislikes it, he hates it. And my argument was, and we, of course, this conversation leads into a conversation about Wagner and a bunch of other people. And my argument was, I still like his music. I still listen to his music because I can't help but like his music. I don't think you have a choice in what music you like. And the contemptible behavior, even if you define, I'm not sure that I even agree that it was contemptible behavior, but even if we're talking about Wagner, or if we're talking about even my hero, John Lennon, who maybe earlier in his life had engaged in some activity that wasn't necessarily, the most acceptable. My argument has always been, first of all, I don't know these people. I've never met these people, and I'm unlikely to meet these people. So who they are as individuals, as people, while distressing, everybody's only human. Everybody makes mistakes. And, I'm not sure everybody should be judged quite so harshly. But also, I just don't think you have a choice in music that appeals to you. I feel like it's almost a chemical. It's an emotional thing. It's a sensory thing, but I think it's also a chemical thing. I think it's a response to stimuli that your body enjoys, and you don't really have a choice in it. I wonder if you see it the same way, or if you have a different thought on it.
Well, I agree with you as far as not having a choice. I suppose we have some choice, or we can choose to ignore our emotional response, I suppose, our visceral response. But I think the bigger question is it important to us what type of dichotomies exist within the artist? What the personal life versus the artistic life. You mentioned Wagner as one, and that's a great example because his personal philosophies were absolutely vile. He was a horrible human being. I mean, he was absolutely a despicable, with no moral compass at all. And yet he wrote some of the most achingly beautiful music in the history of mankind. You then have to, how is that even possible? Well, it is. The artist and the man don't always go hand in hand. You mentioned John Lennon. I mentioned John Lennon as well before, and John Lennon, who said give peace a chance, and sang about all you need is love, and all of that is true. Also wrote used to be angry young man.
Right.
You know,
Yeah.
and you know, in what was the other one? You better run while you can. You know,
Run for your life. Yeah.
Run for your life if you can. You know, I mean,
Yeah.
certainly threatening his partner. And while I can't verify this as being true, there are stories out there that as a younger man, he was a beater.
Right.
You know? He physically abused his wife.
I can tell you, actually, let me put your mind at ease with hedging your words on that one. He admitted to that himself in his interview with Playboy. So, and you don't, nobody has to take my word for that. It's out there. It's documented. You can find it. Yeah.
Okay, so we don't have to worry about anybody threatening to sue you or
right.
over slandering John Lennon.
Right.
Yeah, but you know, that's the thing. There have been many great artists who had aspects of their life that were not so pleasant. You know, there is. I knew, and again, I'd rather not mention his name, but I knew the what used to be referred to as the illegitimate son. Realized that doesn't matter nowadays, but back in the early 1950s, having an illegitimate son was a big deal, and being an illegitimate child was a big deal. A much different time from now, and one of the great classical guitarists of that period had an illegitimate son who he absolutely refused to acknowledge.
Mm-hmm.
And yet everybody knew that it was his son. I mean, everybody knew it.
Yeah.
So, you know, again, great classical guitarist, important influence on me, an important influence on the world of music. And yet, you know, he had this, and you can say the same thing in visual art. I don't think anybody thinks that Pablo Picasso was a nice guy. You know?
Yeah. Well, I hope you'll forgive me for even asking the question. It may be unfair to ask any artist that question. However, as I've mentioned the last time you and I spoke, your influence on my life went far beyond the music lessons that we took. You were a very generous teacher who would take extra time to explain things to me about literature and art and film, and it always did tie back into music. It's not as if it wasn't eventually getting to any kind of a point. You really gave me a very well-rounded look at what makes music special, what makes it important, and what its place is in life, in the world. And you did that by helping me draw connections and draw lines between different ideas and different disciplines. And that's why I wouldn't even ask that question of anybody else, but because it's you, I was interested in hearing what the answer was. So thank you for that. And forgive me if it was an unfair question.
No apologies necessary. I don't feel it was an unfair question in any way, shape, or form.
Excellent. Thank you. Actually, I'm glad that we're sort of morphing into this topic now, because anybody who listens to my show will have heard my interview with Livingston Taylor, and you were very kind to reach out to me after that interview about the discussion that he and I had about sort of trying to encourage students to read music. And the place,
Yes.
one of the places that I teach at is School of Rock. And I love teaching there, and I love everybody that I work with and for, and I love everyone I teach. But of course, it is School of Rock. So the emphasis isn't always necessarily on learning how to read music, although the School of Rock method, let me be clear, the School of Rock method does include reading and writing music. It's just that the students that you get in that kind of environment very often are like, no, I just want to learn a Guns N' Roses song. And trying to find a way to sort of broaden their minds and give them the encouragement to actually read the music. Let me just say this. When I was first learning to play guitar, long before you and I ever met, this is back in the 80s, I always thought I was the worst guitarist in the school. And that was because I couldn't really play lead guitar. I was learning how to play Beatles songs, and I was playing in my church, and I was doing a lot of rhythm guitar, and I was learning about harmony and things like that. But I couldn't play the solo from, the Iron Maiden song that everybody wanted to do. And everybody who was a guitar player in my school was able to do that. They all went to the same teacher. You know who he is, actually. And he was an excellent teacher. I eventually did study with him. But he was the guy who taught you how to shred, basically. If you wanted to learn how to play like Eddie Van Halen or Steve Vai or Yngwie Malmsteen, this is the guy that you went to. And so everybody was going to this guy, and they were learning these amazing solos. And I wasn't. I was only learning chords, and I was learning how to sing, and I was learning all these things. And I tell this to my students often. This is a story I often repeat. When eventually we started putting bands together with our friends, I would inevitably usually end up in the band just because, I could play rhythm guitar pretty well, but I also sing. So there was always a spot for me in a band. But when it came time to start working out the songs with some of these guys who were learning how to be shredders, you'd be like, all right, we're going to do this song. It's key of A. Here we go. And they'd be like, oh, wait. What do you mean key of A? Key of A. It's in the key of A. Oh, I don't do chords, man. I can play the solo perfectly, but I just can't play any chords. It's like, well, all right, great. We're glad to have you that you can play the solo, but we really need you to play the chords too, And it was at that moment, after a succession of encounters like this, I started to realize I'm not the worst guitar player in the school. I'm actually one of the guys who knows how to put a band together and keep it going because I know chords. And I know a little bit about reading music.
It's part of being a musician. I mean, that's the point. Is are you a one-trick pony, or are you a well-rounded musician? And I think that's really important. I was, it's funny because when you were interviewing Livingston Taylor, first of all, I've been a fan of his since the 1970s. I saw him play live at Westbury Music Fair, and I can't recall who he was opening for, but I know he was opening for somebody. Mm-hmm. And a few months after that, he was appearing at what was then Avery Fisher Hall at Lincoln Center, and I ran out and bought tickets for that because I really had enjoyed him. So I've been a fan of his for a while, and I was so pleased that the subject of reading music came up, and he was addressing it, and you were talking to him about it. And in the back of my mind, I was thinking, Scott's talking about it, having learned how to read music when he was a kid.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure I'm the guy that taught him how to read.
You are, yes. You absolutely 100%. 100%.
So I found that to be interesting. But, it's and you guys, both of you, hit on something that I've said to many of my students, which is, when they say, hey, Eric Clapton doesn't read music, and I go, well, are you Eric Clapton? Are you as incredibly gifted, incredibly talented and brilliant as he is, and B, do you think you're going to be as lucky as he is? Because that's what it's going to take. It takes both an incredible talent and an incredible amount of luck to be a rock star. You've got a better chance getting into the NFL.
Yeah, you really do. You really do.
Yeah, exactly. So you got to take that off the table and say, well, okay, so if you're going to be a musician, you need to be a well-rounded musician, as you pointed out. That's very important. And you can look at some of the great players. I mean, hey, you know what? Where would Steve Vai be if he didn't read music?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Dead in the water. Absolutely. Well, this. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
He's a great talent. He's an amazing talent. But it was the reading music that got his foot in the door with Frank Zappa.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I have to give credit here to, first of all, the idea, I feel like I should address this. The idea that and I'm the one who propagated it in that last interview, that the Beatles didn't read or write music, is true in the strictest sense of the word. But I have to give credit to, there's a gentleman who does a series of YouTube videos named Rick Beato, who
I know his videos.
I love that guy, and he addressed this topic about the Beatles not reading music, and he said, listen, let's get something straight right now. He was like, maybe they didn't read or write music on paper, but he said those cats understood theory. He was like, it was somehow, whether it was magic or whether it was nature, nurture, whatever it was, somehow all four of these guys, all four of them, Ringo included, understood theory at its most basic level. In other words, John Lennon may not have known, or Paul McCartney may not have known, that it was a plagal cadence at the end of She's Leaving Home, but they knew what they were doing.
And what's interesting is when I was teaching, teaching as a full-time profession. Mainly I was teaching classical guitar, but I also did have one section of a fairly advanced music theory class. We were teaching four-part writing, which is basically writing music in four-part harmonies, written down as if you're writing for a chorus, And one of the things that comes up fairly late in the second semester of this is something called secondary dominance, and which is something that's going to be way beyond most of your listeners, I'm sure, but it's a fairly advanced concept in theory that just makes music a lot more interesting. I've always used the Beatles song "This Boy." Mm-hmm. As a way of teaching it, because it uses it extensively. So this is this advanced music theory concept that is in what on the surface sounds like your typical 1-6-2-5-1 progression, which is kind of like the old song Silhouette or Earth Angel, or it's the same progression as hundreds of songs from the late 1950s and early 1960s. And what did the Beatles do? They went and they took that same formula and added in a bunch of secondary dominants to get to the bridge. And it's brilliant. It is absolutely brilliant. Well, you know what? They didn't know what they were doing in terms of paper, writing it down in standard notation, but they had ears. They had amazing ears. They could hear what they needed to do to make it interesting.
Yeah, it's so true. And also, I mean, a lot of the credit, I think, has to go to, well, certainly George Martin by the time they get into the studio. Whatever they didn't understand in terms of writing it down or reading it, they had George Martin right there to sort of guide them through that. So all due credit to that master.
Absolutely.
But also you have to take into account, their upbringing and where they were and what the period of history was. If you were growing up in Liverpool at that period of time, you certainly they were listening to Elvis and Little Richard and Buddy Holly and the Everly Brothers, but they were also listening to show tunes, and they were listening to, vaudeville music. They were listening to, there weren't rock radio stations even really in the U.S. at that point, let alone in Britain. So everything that you listen to becomes a part of who you are as a musician, everything. I can't tell you, I talk to my students sometimes, and I'm like, one of the first things I'll ask a student when they come in is what kind of music they like. But I always, before they have a chance to answer, I say, before you tell me, understand there's no wrong answer to that question. And to prove it, I'm going to tell you what two of my favorite things are. I love John Denver. and I love music from Sesame Street. And they always laugh when I say Sesame Street, and I'm like, you laugh, and that's cool.
Good stuff.
But it's some of the great, like Joe Raposo and all these amazing writers who were writing for Sesame Street at that time were no joke, and it's, look, it's PBS. I know it's PBS in its infancy, but they were hiring the very, very best of the very best, whether it was the writers or the educators or even the musicians, and certainly Jim Henson, but that's really, that to me is the core of it all. It's diversity. It's being able to get past whatever peer pressure has forced you into thinking that you like. Maybe you really do like it, but there's so many other things out there.
Pay attention to the music from Mr. Rogers, Fred Rogers.
Oh, he was great.
Rogers. Yeah, he was an accomplished jazz piano player himself, and he brought in some of the top jazz players to work with him to provide music, and I mean, it's great stuff. I mean, it's really great stuff.
Yeah. Well, listen, Robert, I wish we had more time. I only have an hour program, and we've already been talking for a half hour of that. So if I want to keep the program at an hour, we're going to have to cut it here. But please, before we go, where can people go to find out about what you're up to? What's the best website or the best forum to follow you at?
Well, a good I'm on Facebook. You just search for, if you look for Robert Phillips, you'll find it. I've got a fan page on there. A real easy way to find me is my website. My website is robert-phillips.com.
Excellent. Can't ask for more than that. And I just, one more time, the same as I did last time, I want to wrap this up by really thanking you for not just helping me to develop into hopefully a good musician, but I think you helped me to develop into a good person as well. And I will forever be grateful for that. And I can't wait to have you back on the program again. Thank you so much for your time.
You're very welcome, Scott.